So a monster day in the association yesterday. We were part of it here in South Florida, but believe it or not, we were not even close to the biggest story. Joining us now, Brian Geltzeiler, SiriusXM NBA Radio. Geltz, good to talk to you. Good to see you here. Yesterday, tons of news. And I mean, you had Joel Embiid, who scored 70. Karl-Anthony Towns scores 62 and gets ripped by his coach after the game. Those two weren't even close to the bigger stories. Yesterday was one of the crazier days in the league in a while, right?
Yeah, a lot going on. First of all, Embiid, let's talk about Embiid for a minute here. He set the Sixers single game scoring record. This is the Sixers. He broke Wilt Chamberlain's single game scoring record. This is an organization, Moses Malone, Dr. J, Allen Iverson. You go up and down the line here with some of the great players that this organization has had come through it. And for him to do that's an amazing accomplishment. I'm glad you brought up Minnesota because Karl-Anthony Towns scored 62 points in a game, got benched and ripped by his coach, and really pretty much called immature. And really, quite frankly, I give Chris Finch all the credit in the world. That was the appropriate characterization. And he sees that he has a title contender on his hands, and he does. And he's not going to let bad behavior creep in no matter what. Give him all the credit in the world. Then, obviously, Adrian Griffin getting fired, the Terry Rozier trade. It was action-packed yesterday. And listen, this is the NBA. The NBA will creep up on you with stuff that you never figure is going to happen, and there it is. And sometimes it all happens at once.
So let's talk about our local perspective first. Let's talk about Kyle Lowry. Before the trade was made yesterday, from an outside perspective, from a national perspective, like from yourself, what was your view on the 2.5-year relationship of Kyle Lowry and the Miami Heat?
Listen, I think it was disappointing for the Heat. I think Lowry in his own way may have been disappointed too, but it was always a struggle for Kyle Lowry to, let's face it, to adhere to the conditioning requirements that go along with being a member of the Miami Heat. Pat Riley, after his first season there in his offseason address, brought up Kyle Lowry's conditioning. Now, again, older player, tough to stay healthy sometimes, but he never quite adhered to that. And I think his performance was less than what was expected. And certainly his performance did not commensurate with his salary to the extent that I thought the Miami Heat wanted it to. I think for Lowry, he felt like he was being paid to be this veteran presence on a team that was going to contend. And he certainly did have moments last year in the playoffs where he was extremely valuable. But you look at his time this year and the way things had fallen off, especially over the course of the last couple of weeks, where, I mean, the Heat demoted him from the starting lineup and have been playing a point guardless type of setup without him because they just didn't feel like he was doing enough, and his shooting was terrible, and he's wearing down as an older player here and really isn't a starter anymore. The Heat needed a starting point guard, and they got a really good one, and they got a guy that his whole style of play, his whole demeanor on the basketball court is very consistent with what the Miami Heat preach and the way their organization operates. So, listen, it's a great job by the Heat front office, Pat Riley, Andy Ellisberg. They go and they get a guy that fits really, really well. And by the way, keep in mind, Miami's biggest obstacle last year to get to the finals was the Boston Celtics. This is a guy that's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder when it comes to beating the Boston Celtics. So strategic in that respect also. Listen, Terry Rozier's been at, we're being frank about it, John, it's an NBA outpost where he's been right now. Okay. The fact of the matter is that Charlotte is just an afterthought in the NBA. I hate to say it, but it's the way the organization has been run. It's the lack of success that they've had. It's an NBA outpost. He goes from there to being in South Beach, relevant in a team that is there to contend and win titles every single season. And I think you're going to get a really, really hungry player here in Terry Rozier.
To me, this is a home run of a trade. I mean, I couldn't wait for Kyle Lowry to get out of here. I've never disliked a player for the Miami Heat more than I've disliked Kyle Lowry. So just getting him out of here is huge. But then to also turn it into Terry Rozier, who is, 23 points per game this year. He's given out 6.5 assists. And yes, somebody's got to score in Charlotte. It's a terrible team. They're going to score 95, 100 points every night, no matter what. Somebody's got to score those points. But here's the thing, Geltz. He's having a career year. He's shooting 46% overall, 36% from three. And you can't even say, oh, okay, it's a contract year, so he's playing his ass off. He's got 2.5 years left under contract. So this, to me, they're striking while the iron's hot with Terry Rozier.
Yeah, let's go to the contract first, because I'm glad you brought that up. It's a really fair contract, like mid-20s this year and for 2 more. It's really a fair contract. And so for Miami, getting a guy with reasonable cost controls at his age that can do what he does, you're right about the year that he's been having. And I think you lent the proper perspective to 23 points a game. He's not going to average 23 points a game for Miami because the shots aren't going to be there. However, I could see a spike in his shooting percentages, certainly that 36% from 3, because his shot quality is going to be better playing with Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo and Tyler Hero and Jaime Jaquez. You're playing with better players, and that's going to help Terry Rozier immensely. And I think you're going to see a very energized guy. Listen, he's always been a high effort guy. He's always been ultra competitive. He plays angry, and I love that. I mean, the nickname Scary Terry. He plays angry. The other thing that I like a lot about him, which is really important, is the defensive versatility, John. All right, you can put him. He can guard 6 foot and quick. He can guard 6'8" and strong. Like, he's a strong player at his size. He's really good defensively. It's going to allow a lot of different looks for Miami on the perimeter, much better than Lowry. And I think, listen, when you look at the big picture with the Heat, anybody you bring in's got to be able to guard, just because you're always with the challenge of hiding Tyler Hero. It's always that challenge. You need him on the floor because of his shooting and his offense, but you got to hide him. And listen, to a lesser extent, Duncan Robinson at times. Bringing in a guy that can guard's really big. Here's one other piece of perspective that I think is important to look at. The Heat got outbid for Drew Holiday by the Boston Celtics once he was traded in a Lillard deal to Portland. Holiday right now, first of all, is not having the year that he had last year. And that's one thing to note. The second thing is that this is a contract year for Holiday. Terry Rozier is signed out for this year and 2 more. You can make the case that Rozier is a better fit, not only basketball-wise, but at his age, but contractually as well, than Drew Holiday would have been on the Miami Heat.
All right, so let me ask you this, because I brought this up on the show already today. You know, everybody knows that the Heat, they didn't even really strike out on Damian Lillard. They never really seemed to have the chance at Damian Lillard. The Blazers, Joe Cronin, they weren't interested in engaging with the Heat. You had a whole pride situation, an emotional situation that got a hold of the Blazers in that spot. But if we look back now at what the Heat likely would have been willing to or had to give up for Damian Lillard, you're talking Hero, you're talking Robinson, either Jaquez or Jovic, and who knows how many draft picks. That's what they'd have had to give up for Lillard. Or they give up Kyle Lowry and a first-round draft pick for Terry Rozier. Can you make the case that things worked out pretty well for the Heat?
Yes, that probably they worked out better, especially when you're watching the defensive struggles that Milwaukee's having and the role Damian Lillard is playing in that. I want to go back for a minute, because I will say this about, with some perspective and talking to some people over the course of the months since the Lillard deal went down with Milwaukee. There was 2 sides there. Number one, and this is just a fact. Joe Cronin wasn't interested in Tyler Hero as a lead piece to the deal. And that's who the Heat had as a lead piece. So he didn't necessarily engage enthusiastically because he wasn't interested in the player. And then I think it's important to note, and I think Miami learned something from this going forward. And yes, you're always learning. As experienced as Pat Riley is and Andy Ellisberger and all the success that they've had, there was an arrogance out of them in terms of them being the one place Lillard wanted to go to and that Lillard should be sent there. And I think part of that arrogance is what kept Cronin from engaging. And I'm not defending Cronin, because I do think you kick the tires on every offer, and it's possible to go involve third teams. So it's maybe he could have been more open to listening. But I think the Heat, through how they negotiated, came out of that saying, you know what, maybe we could have been a little more conciliatory and met them in the middle a little more negotiating wise, with the knowledge that Lillard only wanted to come to us. And they, there was this notion out there with Damian Lillard that the Portland had to send him to Miami, that they owed it to him. And Joe Cronin never saw it that way. And I think the Heat front office did see it that way. And I think in the future, if a situation like that ever came up again, I think you'd see this Heat front office deal with it a little bit differently. But to your point, they landed on their feet with a younger player who's a better defensive player. And with Hero playing like he's playing, with Robinson playing like he's playing, with the fact that I never feel like Bam Adebayo has the ball enough or gets enough usage on this team, I could make the case Rozier's a better fit than Lillard ever would have been based upon usage. Because in the end, who takes big shots from Miami? Lillard's beautiful thing. He'll carry scoring load, but he will take and make big shots for your team late in games. I can ask, is he even touching the ball in some of those spots for Miami? Because Jimmy Butler takes those shots. And by the way, with the volume that he makes those shots and how he's played and how he's carried this team, you don't want anybody but Jimmy Butler taking those shots. So I the notion that the Heat landed better here with Rozier and still have draft picks and Jaquez and Jovic, and I think you're correct. I think they landed better. Think about it this way. This is how I would think about it. Forget the draft picks for a minute. Are you better off right now with Lillard? Okay, or are you better off essentially with Rozier, Jaquez, and Hero? I don't think it's an issue. You're better off with Rozier, Jaquez, and Hero. One of the issues that he'd had last year in the finals against Denver was push came to shove. The rotation wasn't deep enough. You have some of that needed depth in the rotation now with the way Robinson's played, the way Hero's played, and the massive contribution that Jaquez has made.
What do you think the rest of the league thinks, or specifically the Eastern Conference, the big dogs in the East, when the Heat make that trade yesterday?
Listen, Bill Simmons had a tweet yesterday, and he's, the biggest Celtics fan out there in the media. And I think it speaks for a lot of what the rest of the Eastern Conference is looking, that he has felt all along to his Celtics, the biggest threat is not the Bucks, is not the Sixers, is the Heat. And that threat got larger yesterday. And with the understanding that Miami this year, above last year, is having a better regular season and doing a better job, which means they're not going to have to come from as difficult a seeding place to be able to advance deep into the playoffs. I think the rest of the Eastern Conference, especially the top of the Eastern Conference, got a little nervous yesterday. Because here's the other thing about the Celtics. Because the Celtics are head and shoulders above everybody right now. They're above the Bucks. They're above the Sixers. And as a regular season team right now, they're above the Heat. Now, the playoffs start. Things are entirely different. The Heat, they have a different level that they take it to in the playoffs. And this team is built to compete in the playoffs. That's the way that it's always been. But I think for the Celtics, it's not only adding a player like Rozier, it's adding Rozier. Let's not forget how unhappy Terry Rozier was his last year in Boston when he was relegated to the bench after being a starting point guard for a team that went to the Eastern Conference Finals for Kyrie Irving, who was a very poor teammate there and acted the entire time like he didn't want to be there. And he was Rozier ended up playing 18 minutes a game behind Kyrie Irving, even though he felt he had earned more. So you look at that, and now Rozier with a chip on his shoulder playing the Celtics, absolutely. Listen, to Terry Rozier right now, he feels like he should be a part of that. Think about the guy they traded him for, Kemba Walker. He's out of the league. He's been out of the league a year and a half. Okay, Kemba Walker, they traded him for. Rozier's got, and Rozier's not a guy that's going to forget. He's at where he is in the NBA because, again, he plays angry and he remembers stuff. Rozier's going to have a chip on his shoulder. This could be a mini little nightmare for the Boston Celtics, having to go against the guy who wants to take the head off your team figuratively in the worst way. It becomes a tough spot for Boston.
Let's talk a little bit about the other news, the big news, the biggest news yesterday, and that was the Bucks firing Adrian Griffin. It could be a shock to a lot of people. I actually think it's a smart move by the Bucks in this sense. It's obviously the difficult move to fire a coach when you're 30-13, but they clearly identified a scenario where we think we have a problem here. And if you have a problem and you wait for it to actually be a problem, meaning when they lose in the first round of the playoffs, you've waited too long. They looked at it yesterday and said, I could see that we're going to have a problem. So before that happens, we're going to try and fix it and do something about it right now. So I actually commend the Bucks for making the move yesterday. But if they're going to hire Doc Rivers, I don't understand what we're doing there. You look at Philadelphia, they're so much better this year than they've been the last few years with Doc as the head coach. So I think it's been a weird 24 hours for the Bucks.
It has been. Now, John, I'm going to start here. They knew they had a problem before they played a game this season because they brought Terry Stotts in to be his lead assistant. Now, there's a trend that's going on in the NBA right now. That's a difficult trend for coaches. And no one really wants to talk about it. I'm happy to talk about it. very rarely, if ever, do head coaches get to hire their own coaching staffs. They're told who's on their coaching staffs. Adrian Griffin was given Terry Stotts, and he was given Terry Stotts 2 months before the Damian Lillard deal was made. So Damian Lillard lands there. Stotts was his head coach for 9 years in Portland. They have a long-standing relationship. All right. When Terry Stotts quit because Adrian Griffin embarrassed him in front of the team and the coaching staff because he didn't come into a coach's huddle as quickly as Griffin wanted him to, because he was in the midst of discussing something and working with Damian Lillard on something, they knew they had a problem. Because essentially what Griffin was doing was stripping himself of having a guy that the players on the team could see as an alternate authority to him. And for a rookie head coach, that becomes a very lonely and dangerous spot. And I do think if Stotts was there, this would have happened earlier, because I think they just would have moved Stotts over. Because I think one of the things that we're looking at here, and I'm going to get to Doc Rivers, because I don't know that you're giving Doc Rivers a fair shake, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Forgetting about Doc for a minute, ask Quinn Snyder how brutally difficult it is to walk into a team that you hadn't coached all year and have to pick up and coach that team. It is absolutely brutal. And one of the reasons Doc was brought in as a coaching consultant, and let's say I've heard through the grapevine, and I wouldn't go on record to confirm this, but I've heard through the grapevine, it was a little longer than the 1 month that's being reported, that Doc has been hanging around there and consulting with that organization on the coaching that's going on with that team. It's very hard to step in and be able to do something and be able to be successful. So now, but I will say this about Doc. Let me defend Doc for a minute. All right. Doc got fired in Philly for one reason and one reason only. Got fired in Philly because James Harden wanted him gone. And then James Harden turned around after they fired Doc for James Harden and said, I want to be traded. But so Doc, I think Doc's a little bit bitter about that, and I don't totally blame him. Doc did a really good job in Philly last year. Where things went bad was that James Harden became really difficult to coach. And listen, Doc has done, I think, 3 or 4 of these with Bill Simmons on the Bill Simmons podcast, and he'll discuss out loud. He doesn't care. He's not holding back on how difficult it was to coach James Harden and how the tone and tenor of Harden listening to him completely and entirely changed when Harden didn't make the All-Star team. James Harden was very hard for him to coach, especially in the playoffs, where Harden had to have the ball in his hands and at some very key times refused to actually shoot the basketball, John. So Doc had a tough time there last year, but Doc has an idea what he wants to do defensively. Here's Doc's problem. Okay, first of all, I'm telling you right now, he's going back to Budenholzer's drop defense. That's what, if I had to take over this job and I've been on the staff all year, that's what I would do. Because that's your best defensive player is Lopez. Your best defensive player used to be Holiday, even though Lopez was second in defensive player of the year voting last year. But this year, your best defensive player is Lopez. He's best in drop. You're going back to drop defense. The problem is that you don't have the requisite individual perimeter defenders to be able to play drop successfully and be able to do it in the playoffs. With a team like the Celtics that loves to shoot threes like that, you start playing drop and leave them open threes, they're going to bury you. They will bury you. They'd sweep the Bucks in a series. And that's the biggest problem that Doc has right now, is that the system that they have to play, the system he has to go back to, he doesn't have the horses. And by the way, they can't make a move. One other thing here, and it relates to the Bucks tangentially, but I think it's important to note because it applies to Kyle Lowry. And that's the point that, listen, Woj reported yesterday Charlotte's going to try to trade Lowry. They're not going to be successful in trading Lowry. Teams are not going to give up anything for Lowry. They're going to sit back and wait for Kyle Lowry to be bought out. All right? When he is bought out, because of now this new CBA, if you're above the first tax apron, you can't bring him in because his contract was too much money. If he makes over $12.5 million, you can't bring him in. That knocks out the Bucks to go get a guy like Lowry. That knocks out the Celtics. That knocks out the Denver Nuggets. Okay, it knocks out the Clippers. It knocks out even the Sixers are $1 million into the first apron. It knocks them out. So what are you looking at? You're looking at Minnesota. You're looking at the Knicks. You're looking at Dallas. So here's my point about Milwaukee, circling back to them. The cavalry can't really come. They got nothing else to trade, and they can't better this team. Doc's walking into a really, really tough spot here, John.
Yeah, and speaking of which, how much do you think Giannis is taking a lot of heat right now, I guess, that he got the coach fired. Do you think that played much of a role?
Yeah, listen, Giannis got him hired. So let's start there.
Right.
Okay. It's been widely reported that the front office wanted Nick Nurse to coach this team. And Nick Nurse wanted to coach this team. So Giannis got Griffin hired. Giannis started the ball rolling on him getting fired, but it wasn't just Giannis. It was Damian Lillard. It was Brooke Lopez. It was Bobby Portis. Bobby Portis, there's a report. Bobby Portis called him out in the locker room in front of everybody after the in-season tournament semifinal loss to the Indiana Pacers. So it was everybody across the board that was on board with this. Listen, the Stotts thing did not exactly endear him to Dame. And I think Giannis is bearing the brunt of having him fired. I think Dame actually may have played more of a role in having him fired. But the thing is, when you're 6 games into the season, and you have 4 of your top players come into the coach's office and say, what you're doing defensively isn't working. This is really important in the NBA. The thing in the NBA that you have to understand is that as a head coach, you earn the players' respect by having them perceive, not even if it's real, but having them perceive that you're adding value to them winning games. And you're adding value to them winning games and getting paid. Griffin, from the jump, they could see wasn't adding value. And once the players see that you're not adding value, buy-in is difficult. When you have a veteran team that's supposed to be a title contender and you don't have buy-in at the top end of your roster, you're done. So when you think about it in those terms, 30-13 doesn't mean all that much. And kind of surprised it didn't happen sooner.
Yeah. Brian, excellent job. You can hear Brian at SiriusXM NBA Radio a lot of the times on the weekend with Sam Mitchell. Did I leave anything else out? Where can folks catch you at?
No, that's all. NBA weekend every Saturday morning, 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern time. I also host This Week in NBA Radio, which is Sundays, 8 to 10 a.m. Eastern time and sporadic times over on SiriusXM NBA Radio. You can catch me every Friday at 5:40 on NBA Today with Justin Termini, Eddie Johnson, doing my weekly spot with them as well. And we have a lot of fun in those weekly spots. But John, thanks so much for having me.
Do they give you a chance in between their arguing? They give you a chance to get some words in there?
So here's the cool thing about the spot is that I'm actually kind of like Judge Judy. So they'll bring up stuff to me that the two of them are screaming and arguing about. And I'm supposed to be the one that is the moderator, so to speak, where I say what side I take. The thing is, that role for me gets me abused because the one that doesn't like what I have to say, all of a sudden my dietary habits come into question. I mean, they're attacking me hard. And listen, it's a lot of fun. Those guys are great. I have a blast doing that with them. But we have a good time at NBA Radio. We really do.
Awesome job, Geltz. I appreciate you. Thank you so much, man.
Always, John. My pleasure, buddy. You take care.